The silence in the command center was broken only by the soft hum of alien technology and the quiet breathing of the officers who stood around the tactical display. Commander of the Third Fleet had seen many battles in his 400 cycles of service, but never had he felt the cold grip of uncertainty that now squeezed his primary heart. The holographic display showed the approaching enemy fleet in stark detail. 700 warships, each one a kilometer-long instrument of destruction, moving in perfect formation toward the contested system of Altair Prime. The mineral-rich worlds of this system had been the subject of a bitter territorial dispute for nearly 2 standard years, and now it seemed they had decided to settle the matter through overwhelming force. Its own fleet numbered only 93 ships, a modest defensive force that had been considered adequate for protecting merchant convoys and deterring raiders. Against the approaching armada, they would last perhaps 20 minutes before being reduced to cosmic debris. "Sir," came the voice of his communications officer, her 4 eyes blinking rapidly in the pattern that indicated extreme stress among her species. "We're receiving a transmission from the human vessel." His mandibles clicked together in what his species considered a gesture of mild amusement, though there was no humor in the sound. The human ship. A single vessel, barely 200 meters in length, that had arrived in the system 3 days ago with a crew of only 42 individuals. The humans had requested permission to assist in the defense of Altair Prime, claiming they had interests in maintaining the peace. At first had been inclined to politely decline their offer. Humans were a relatively new species to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 of their years ago. Their technology was considered primitive by most standards, and their military capabilities were largely untested in large-scale conflicts. The idea that 42 humans in a single ship could make any meaningful difference against 700 warships seemed almost laughable. But there had been something in the human captain's voice during their initial communication that had given pause. Captain Sarah had spoken with a quiet confidence that seemed oddly out of place given the circumstances. When she had assured him that her ship would pull its weight in the coming battle, there had been no boasting, no false bravado. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty usually reserved for discussing the laws of physics. "Put them through," said, his attention returning to the present moment. The holographic display shimmered and was replaced by the image of Captain. She was a small woman by human standards, perhaps 50 of their years in age, with graying hair pulled back in a functional style and eyes the color of their oceans. Like most humans, she appeared almost fragile compared to the heavily built, but had learned not to judge other species by their physical appearance. "Commander," said, her voice carrying clearly through the translation matrix, "I've been monitoring the approach. They'll be in weapons range in approximately 6 hours. "That is correct," Captain replied. "I must confess I am reconsidering my decision to accept your offer of assistance. The odds we face are substantial. It would be no dishonor for your ship to withdraw to a safe distance." Something that might have been a smile flickered across features. "Commander, with all due respect, we didn't come here to withdraw. My crew and I have reviewed the tactical situation, and we have some suggestions that might improve our chances." Secondary heart skipped a beat. Improve their chances, against odds of more than 7 to 1, he found himself curious despite the dire circumstances. "I am listening, Captain." "They are approaching in a standard battle formation, correct? Heavy cruisers in the front, carriers protected in the center, destroyers screening the flanks." "That is their typical deployment, yes. And they're maintaining tight formation discipline, probably planning to overwhelm your defensive positions through concentrated firepower." Nodded. It was exactly what their tactical computers had predicted. They were known for their methodical approach to warfare, preferring to crush opposition through superior numbers and coordinated attacks, rather than relying on clever tactics or advanced technology. "Here's what we propose," continued. "My ship will make a high-speed run at their formation, targeting their command vessel. While they're distracted dealing with us, your fleet can reposition to take advantage of the chaos." The suggestion was so audacious that almost laughed. "Captain, I appreciate your courage, but a single ship cannot hope to penetrate that kind of defensive screen. You would be destroyed within minutes of beginning your attack run." "Maybe," said simply, "but maybe not. Commander, there are things about human military doctrine that the rest of the galaxy doesn't fully understand yet. Things we've learned through difficult experience." There was something in her tone that made skin ridge slightly, an involuntary response to what his species recognized as the presence of a predator. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. For just a moment, Captain had sounded less like a starship officer and more like something that hunted in the dark spaces between worlds. What kind of experience, Captain? The kind that teaches you that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. The kind that shows you how to turn desperation into an advantage. Paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the command center. Commander, my species has been fighting wars for longer than we've had written language. We've learned things about combat that textbooks don't teach. Things about what it means to fight when you have everything to lose and nothing left to gain, except the chance to make your enemy regret their choices. Felt a chill run through his carapace. There was something about the way humans spoke of war that was fundamentally different from other species. The fought for territory and resources. The fought for dominance and expansion. But when humans talked about fighting, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something that spoke of conflicts where the very survival of their species had hung in the balance. What exactly are you proposing, Captain? Give us 12 hours before the main engagement. Let us get close to their fleet while they're still approaching. Once we begin our attack run, wait for our signal, then hit them with everything you have while they're focused on us. And if your ship is destroyed in the attempt? His expression didn't change. Then you'll know we tried, Commander, and you'll have learned something about how humans fight when their backs are against the wall. The communication ended, leaving staring at the empty holographic display. Around him, his officers waited for orders, their body language radiating uncertainty and concern. None of them had expected the humans to volunteer for what amounted to a suicide mission, and none of them were quite sure how to respond to such an offer. Sir, his tactical officer asked quietly, what are your orders? Was quiet for a long moment, considering. Military doctrine was clear about such situations. When facing overwhelming odds, the proper response was to conduct a fighting withdrawal, preserving as much of the fleet as possible while inflicting maximum casualties on the enemy. It was a logical, sensible approach that had served his people well for generations. But something about Captain's proposal nagged at him. There had been a certainty in her voice, a confidence that seemed to go beyond mere bravado or desperate hope. It was as if she knew something that he didn't, something that changed the fundamental equation of the battle they were about to fight. Signal the fleet, he said finally. All ships are to maintain current positions but prepare for rapid redeployment on my command, and send a message to Captain. Tell her she has her 12 hours. As his officers hurried to carry out his orders, found himself wondering if he had just made the greatest mistake of his military career, or if he was about to learn something new about the nature of warfare itself. The next several hours passed with agonizing slowness. The fleet continued its inexorable advance, their formation as precise and intimidating as ever. On the tactical display, they looked like a vast metal storm approaching through the dark, each ship a lightning bolt waiting to strike. The human vessel, by contrast, had simply vanished. Sir, his sensor officer reported, I'm reading no trace of the human ship on any frequency. It's as if they've completely disappeared. Nodded grimly. Modern stealth technology could hide a ship from most sensors, but it required enormous amounts of power and severely limited the vessel's ability to maneuver or fight. If the humans were using such systems, they would be committed to their current course of action with no possibility of retreat or evasion once they revealed themselves. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of all-or-nothing gambit that military historians wrote about when they wanted to illustrate the fine line between brilliance and madness. Commander, his communications officer called out, I'm receiving a priority transmission from High Command. The holographic display activated, revealing the stern features of Fleet Admiral, the supreme commander of all military forces. Was ancient even by standards, his carapace bearing the scars of dozens of battles and his eyes holding the weight of centuries of military experience. Commander, the Admiral said without preamble, I have received reports of your tactical situation. You are hereby ordered to withdraw your fleet to the Deneb system immediately. Sir, replied, we are currently engaged in joint operations with human forces. A withdrawal at this time would leave them without support. The humans chose to involve themselves in this conflict, Commander. That does not obligate us to share their fate. His voice carried the tone of absolute authority that had made him one of the most feared military leaders in history. Your fleet represents a significant investment in resources and trained personnel. I will not see it thrown away in a hopeless gesture. Felt the weight of command settle heavily on his shoulders. Military discipline demanded that he obey the Admiral's orders without question. But something else, something he couldn't quite name, demanded that he stay and see what the humans had planned. "Admiral," he said carefully, "I request permission to delay our withdrawal for 6 more hours. The humans claim to have intelligence about vulnerabilities that could change the tactical situation." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that military officers sometimes told when they believed that following orders would result in a greater disaster than disobeying them. Was quiet for several seconds, his ancient eyes studying space through the holographic connection. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a warning that was unmistakable in its clarity. 6 hours, Commander. After that, I expect to see your fleet in hyperspace, regardless of the situation. Is that understood?" "Understood, sir." The connection ended, leaving alone with his thoughts and his conscience. Around him, his officers maintained their posts with the professional calm that marked experienced military personnel, but he could sense their unease. None of them had expected to be placed in a position where they might have to choose between military discipline and what their instincts told them was right. "Sir," his tactical officer said quietly, "fleet will be in weapons range in 90 minutes. Nodded, his attention returning to the holographic display. Somewhere out there, hidden in the darkness between the stars, 42 humans were preparing to face an enemy that outnumbered them by more than 16 to 1. It was either the most courageous act he had ever witnessed or the most foolish, possibly both. "All ships," he ordered, "charge weapons and prepare for combat, and keep scanning for any sign of the human vessel." The minutes ticked by with mechanical precision, each one bringing the fleet closer to optimal firing range. Found himself checking the chronometer obsessively, watching as the time remaining before Admiral. Deadline grew shorter and shorter. 80 minutes, 70, 60. At 50 minutes, something changed. "Sir," his sensor officer called out, excitement making her voice crack slightly. "I'm detecting multiple energy signatures from the fleet. It looks like they're confused about something." "Elaborate." "Their formation is beginning to shift. Ships are breaking away from their assigned positions, and I'm reading increased communications traffic between their vessels. It's as if they're responding to some kind of threat, but I can't identify what." Felt his pulse quicken. Could it be that the humans had actually managed to penetrate the formation without being detected? It seemed impossible, but there was clearly something happening that had disrupted the enemy's carefully orchestrated advance. "Keep monitoring," he ordered, "and prepare to implement emergency redeployment on my signal." 30 minutes, 20, 10. At exactly the moment when the fleet entered what would normally be considered optimal firing range, the universe suddenly went insane. The first sign was a brilliant flash of light from the center of the enemy formation, followed immediately by an explosion that sent one of their heavy cruisers tumbling out of control. Before they could react, a second explosion blossomed near their command ship, then a third near their carrier group. "What in the void is happening over there?" his tactical officer demanded. The answer came in the form of a transmission from Captain. When her image appeared on the holographic display, she was seated in what was obviously a combat bridge, with emergency lighting casting strange shadows across her features and the sounds of weapon fire audible in the background. "Commander," she said, her voice calm despite the obvious chaos around her, "we're in position and beginning our primary attack run. I suggest you implement your redeployment now while their attention is focused on us." "Captain, how did you penetrate their defenses? Our sensors show no sign of your ship until just now." Something that definitely qualified as a smile crossed his face, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Commander, there are advantages to being underestimated. They expected a frontal assault from a single ship. They got something else entirely." Before could ask what she meant, the tactical display lit up with new information as his sensors finally began to track the human vessel. What they showed was impossible according to everything he knew about space combat. The human ship was not making a single attack run. Instead, it was somehow moving through the formation like a predator through a herd, appearing and disappearing seemingly at random, striking targets with surgical precision before vanishing again into the darkness. Each attack was perfectly timed to cause maximum confusion and disruption, turning the enemy's tight formation into a chaotic mess of ships trying desperately to coordinate their response against an opponent they couldn't track consistently. "How are they doing that?" his sensor officer whispered. Had no answer. The human ship seemed to be operating under principles of warfare that he didn't recognize, using tactics that shouldn't have been possible with the technology available to them. It was as if they had found a way to turn the fundamental rules of space combat to their advantage through sheer audacity and perfect timing. "Sir," his tactical officer called out urgently, "the fleet is breaking formation. Multiple ships are turning to pursue the human vessel, leaving gaps in their defensive screen." Didn't hesitate. "All ships, implement attack pattern Delta 7, target the gaps in their formation and concentrate fire on their command vessels. Move." The fleet surged forward like a pack of hunters that had finally found an opening in their prey's defenses. Ships that had been hiding behind asteroid fields and sensor shadows suddenly appeared at optimal firing range, their weapons already charged and ready. Within seconds, the space between the two fleets was filled with energy beams, missiles, and the brilliant flashes of exploding warships. The caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of the forces, struggled to respond. Half their ships were still chasing the elusive human vessel through their formation, while the other half were trying to establish new defensive positions against an enemy that was attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, and for the first time since the enemy fleet had appeared on his sensors, began to think that they might actually have a chance of winning. On the tactical display, the human ship continued its impossible dance through the enemy formation, somehow managing to stay one step ahead of the dozens of vessels trying to destroy it. Each time it seemed certain that they would be overwhelmed by concentrated fire, they would vanish again, only to reappear somewhere else entirely and strike another target before disappearing once more. "Commander's voice came through the communication system again. "We've completed our primary objectives. The enemy command structure is in disarray, and their formation is completely broken. I recommend focusing your attacks on their heavy units while they're still trying to reorganize." "Acknowledged, Captain. What is your status?" "We've taken some damage, but we're still operational. My crew is enthusiastic about the current situation." Could hear it in her voice, and it sent another chill through his carapace. Captain sounded genuinely pleased about being in the middle of a battle against overwhelming odds. Not relieved, not desperate, but pleased, as if this was exactly where she wanted to be. The battle continued for another hour, with the momentum clearly shifting in favor of the Allied forces. Despite their numerical advantage, were unable to coordinate an effective response to the chaotic nature of the engagement. Ships that should have been supporting each other were scattered across the battlefield, isolated and vulnerable to concentrated attacks from the more maneuverable vessels. When the enemy commander finally ordered a retreat, more than half of the fleet had been destroyed or disabled. The remainder fled the system in disorder, their perfect formation reduced to a ragged line of ships limping back toward their own territory. As the last of the enemy vessels disappeared into hyperspace, found himself staring at the tactical display in something approaching amazement. Against all odds, they had won. Not just survived, but actually won a decisive victory against an enemy that should have crushed them without difficulty. "Captain," he said into the communication system, "I believe congratulations are in order. Your tactics were unprecedented." "Just returning the favor, Commander. Your people gave us the opening we needed to make our plan work." "I must ask, how did your ship manage to avoid detection for so long? And how were you able to maneuver through their formation like that?" There was a pause before answered, and when she did, her voice carried a note of something that might have been pride. "Commander, my species learned a long time ago that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure your enemy doesn't realize they're in one until it's too late. We call it asymmetric warfare, and we've gotten very good at it over the years." Asymmetric warfare? Fighting by rules that your opponent doesn't understand, using their expectations against them, making them think they know what kind of battle they're in, right up until the moment they realize they were wrong. Considered this, it was a concept that went against everything he had been taught about honorable combat, but he couldn't argue with the results. and the modifications to your ship that allowed such maneuverability. Let's just say that human engineering tends to prioritize function over form. We built our ship to do a job, not to look impressive doing it. The communication ended, leaving alone with his thoughts once again. Around him, his crew was already beginning the process of damage assessment and casualty reports, but his attention was focused on something else entirely. For the first time in his long military career, he had seen fear in battle. Not his own fear, but the fear of an enemy that had suddenly realized they were facing something they didn't understand. They had come to this system expecting a conventional engagement against a vastly outnumbered opponent. Instead, they had found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow the accepted rules of warfare. And in that moment of confusion and terror, they had been defeated not by superior numbers or advanced technology, but by something far more fundamental: the realization that they were not the most dangerous predators in the galaxy after all. 3 months after the battle at Altair Prime, Commander found himself standing in the observation deck of the Galactic Council's primary space station, watching as human ships moved through the traffic patterns around the massive structure. The vessels were smaller than most military craft in the galaxy, but there was something about the way they moved that caught the eye. They seemed more alive somehow, more responsive, as if they were extensions of their crews rather than mere machines carrying passengers through space. The invitation to address the council had come as a surprise. The military had submitted their standard after-action report following the victory at Altair Prime, but apparently the implications of that battle had resonated far beyond what it expected. Representatives from dozens of species wanted to hear firsthand about the tactics that had turned a hopeless defense into a decisive victory. More importantly, they wanted to understand the humans. The doors to the council chamber slid open with a soft hiss, and found himself facing the assembled representatives of 47 different species. The chamber was vast, designed to accommodate the widely varying physical requirements of the galaxy's diverse intelligent life. Some delegates sat in traditional chairs, while others floated in specialized environmental suits or rested in shallow pools of their native atmosphere. At the center of the semicircular arrangement sat Elder of the Dominion, the current rotating chairperson of the council. Was ancient even by the standards of his long-lived species, his crystalline body showing the subtle fractures that marked centuries of accumulated wisdom and experience. "Commander," the Elder's voice resonated through the chamber's translation matrix, "the Council appreciates your willingness to share your experiences with us. The reports of the engagement at Altair Prime have raised questions about the military capabilities of our member species." Activated his own translation unit and stepped forward to the designated speaking area. "Honored representatives, I am pleased to provide any information that might be useful to the Council's deliberations." "The primary question," said Representative and of the Hegemony Worlds, "concerns the tactical doctrines employed by the human forces. Our military analysts have studied the sensor data from the battle, and much of what occurred seems to contradict established principles of space warfare." "In what way, Representative?" "For one thing," and continued, his tentacles writhing in a pattern that indicated deep skepticism, "the human vessel appeared to violate several fundamental laws of physics. Our experts cannot explain how a ship of that size and mass could maneuver as your reports describe." Had anticipated this question. In the weeks following the battle, his own technical staff had reached similar conclusions. The human ship's performance had been impossible according to conventional understanding of propulsion technology and inertial dynamics. "Representatives, I can only report what I observed. The human vessel demonstrated capabilities that exceeded our expectations, but I am not qualified to explain the technical details of how such performance was achieved." Elder leaned forward slightly, his crystalline features catching the chamber's ambient light. "Commander, we have invited a human representative to address these questions directly. With the Council's permission, I would like to introduce Captain Sarah." The chamber fell silent as Captain entered through a side door. She moved with the same quiet confidence that remembered from their first meeting, seemingly unimpressed by the grandeur of her surroundings or the importance of the beings watching her. She wore what appeared to be a standard human military uniform, practical and unadorned, in stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garments favored by most council representatives. "Honored delegates," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, I understand you have questions about human military technology and tactics. I'm here to answer what I can, though some information remains classified for obvious security reasons. Representative N was the first to speak. Captain, our analysis of the recent engagement suggests that your vessel employed propulsion systems far in advance of what should be possible with your species' current technological development. How do you explain this discrepancy? Smiled and felt that familiar chill run through his carapace. Representative N, I think there might be a misunderstanding about what you observed. Our ship didn't violate any laws of physics. We simply applied them in ways that your analysts didn't expect. Elaborate, please. What your sensors detected as impossible maneuvers were actually the result of very precise timing and positioning. We used gravitational fields, debris clouds, and even the energy discharges from enemy weapons to modify our trajectory and mask our heat signature. It's not about having more advanced technology. It's about using the technology you have more creatively. The explanation sent a murmur through the chamber. Representative of the Synthesis Coalition, whose species was renowned for their engineering expertise, leaned forward with obvious interest. You're suggesting that you achieved superior performance through tactical innovation, rather than technological advancement. Exactly, every species in this chamber has access to the same fundamental technologies: fusion drives, energy shields, particle weapons, sensor arrays. The differences come from how you choose to employ those tools. Paused, her eyes scanning the assembled delegates. Most military doctrines in the galaxy seem to focus on using superior force to overwhelm an opponent. Bigger ships, more weapons, heavier armor. That's certainly one approach, but it's not the only one. Elder spoke into the silence that followed. And what approach does humanity favor, Captain? We prefer to win fights before our enemies realize they're in them. We study our opponents, identify their assumptions about how warfare should be conducted, and then find ways to exploit those assumptions. His voice carried a note of something that made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. In the case of the fleet, they expected a conventional engagement, ships facing each other across open space, exchanging fire until one side achieved numerical superiority. They had no contingency for an opponent that refused to fight by those rules. Are you saying that deception is a fundamental aspect of human warfare? Asked Representative N of the Tribunal States, her voice carrying obvious disapproval. I'm saying that adaptability is a fundamental aspect of human survival. We've learned that the universe doesn't care about your plans or your expectations. The only way to guarantee success is to be prepared for anything and willing to do whatever the situation requires. Found himself remembering the expression on Captain's face during their first communication, the sense that he was speaking to something that understood violence on a level that his own species had never quite grasped. Now, listening to her address the council, he began to understand what that expression had meant. Humans didn't just fight wars. They studied war as an art form, analyzing every aspect of conflict from technological capabilities to psychological factors. They approached battle the way other species approached scientific research, with methodical precision and an willingness to experiment with new concepts. Captain, said Representative of the Maritime Confederation, your description of human tactics suggests a degree of flexibility that some might consider troubling. How does the Council know that such methods would not be turned against Allied forces under different circumstances? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Could sense the tension in the chamber as dozens of representatives waited for response. It was, he realized, the question that everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to ask directly. Was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the chamber. Representative, that's exactly the right question to ask. And the answer is simple. You don't know. You can't know because trust isn't something that can be guaranteed by technology or treaties or mutual self-interest. Trust is something that has to be earned through actions over time. She paused, letting her words sink in. What I can tell you is this. Humanity has no interest in conquest or dominance over other species. We've seen what happens when intelligent beings turn their military capabilities against each other, and we have no desire to repeat those mistakes. Our goal is to find our place in the galactic community as partners and allies, not as conquerors. And if circumstances change, pressed, if humanity decides that its interests are better served through conflict rather than cooperation. Smile returned, but this time it carried a different quality. Not threatening exactly, but deeply serious. Representative, if humanity ever decides to abandon cooperation in favor of conflict, you'll know about it long before it becomes a problem. We're not a species that hides our intentions when we've decided to fight. We're very direct about these things. The chamber fell silent again, found himself studying the faces of the various delegates, noting the mix of fascination and concern that words had generated. The humans were clearly not what most species had expected when they had been granted membership in the galactic community. Elder spoke into the silence. Captain, the Council appreciates your candor. However, your description of human capabilities raises obvious security concerns. If a single human vessel can defeat a fleet of 700 ships through superior tactics alone, what does this mean for the balance of power in our region of the galaxy? Elder, I think you're overestimating what happened at Altair Prime. We didn't defeat 700 ships. We disrupted their formation and created an opportunity for Commander's forces to exploit. The victory belonged to the combined fleet, not to humanity alone. But without your intervention, the forces would have been overwhelmed. True, but without the forces providing follow-up attacks, our disruption tactics would have been nothing more than a temporary annoyance. Effective military action requires coordination between allies, not individual heroics. Found himself nodding in agreement, was correct about the nature of their victory, but he suspected that her modesty was somewhat misleading. The human ship had done far more than simply disrupt enemy formations. They had fundamentally changed the nature of the engagement, turning a conventional space battle into something resembling a hunting expedition. Representative and spoke again, his tentacles now moving in patterns that indicated deep thought. Captain, assuming the Council accepts humanity's assurances about peaceful intentions, how would human military capabilities be integrated into existing defense arrangements? Our current strategies are based on established doctrines that have served the galaxy well for generations. Representative, I don't think integration is the right concept. Human tactics work because they're unexpected. The moment they become part of standard military doctrine, they lose much of their effectiveness. Paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. What I would suggest instead is consultation. When you're facing a military problem that conventional solutions can't solve, ask for human input. We might be able to suggest alternatives that haven't been considered. You're proposing that humanity serve as military advisors rather than as integrated forces. I'm proposing that humanity be allowed to contribute what we do best, finding new solutions to old problems. We're not trying to replace existing military structures. We're offering to supplement them with capabilities that might prove useful in specific circumstances. Elder was quiet for several minutes, his crystalline features reflecting the subtle play of light from the chamber's environmental systems. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had guided galactic policy for centuries. The Council will need time to consider these matters, Captain. The implications of humanity's military capabilities extend far beyond simple tactical considerations. However, I believe I speak for all delegates when I say that your candor has been both appreciated and educational. Inclined her head slightly. Elder, I understand the Council's need for deliberation. If it would be helpful, I'm prepared to provide additional technical briefings or to arrange demonstrations of human tactical concepts under controlled conditions. That may indeed be necessary. For now, however, I believe we have sufficient information to begin our discussions. As the session concluded and delegates began to file out of the chamber, found himself walking alongside Captain toward the exit. The human officer seemed lost in thought, her expression suggesting that she was considering implications that extended far beyond the immediate political situation. Captain said quietly, "May I ask your honest assessment of how the Council received your presentation?" Was quiet for a moment before answering. "Commander, I think they're scared, not of what we might do to them, but of what our capabilities represent. For generations, galactic military doctrine has been based on the assumption that conflicts are resolved through superior force applied in predictable ways. The idea that a smaller force can defeat a larger one through tactical innovation alone challenges some very fundamental beliefs about how power works. And you believe this is a problem. I think it's reality. The universe doesn't care about our assumptions or our comfort levels. Threats can emerge from any direction in any form at any time. The species that survive are the ones that adapt quickly enough to meet new challenges. Paused as they reached the main corridor. The question is whether the galactic community is willing to adapt, or whether they'll try to maintain the status until something forces them to change. As Watched walk away toward the docking bays where the human ships were berthed, he found himself thinking about the nature of change and adaptation. The battle at Altair Prime had been more than just a military engagement. It had been a demonstration that the galaxy was entering a new phase of its development, one where old certainties no longer applied. The humans were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were something potentially more dangerous. They were evolutionary pressure. Their very presence in the galactic community would force other species to reconsider their assumptions about warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of power itself. Whether that was ultimately beneficial or catastrophic remained to be seen. Later that day, as reviewed the official transcripts of the council session, he received an encrypted communication from Fleet Admiral. The message was brief, but significant. High Command was requesting detailed technical specifications for human military systems, along with recommendations for incorporating human tactical concepts into existing training programs. The transformation had already begun. Over the following weeks, similar requests arrived from military commands throughout the galaxy. The hegemony wanted human advisors for their special operations divisions. The Synthesis Coalition requested joint training exercises to evaluate human engineering modifications. Even the traditionally isolationist tribunal states inquired about consulting arrangements for their defensive planning. Found himself in the unusual position of serving as an unofficial liaison between human forces and the various military establishments that wanted to understand what they had witnessed at Altair Prime. It was a role that required diplomatic skills he had never needed as a combat commander, but one that he found surprisingly engaging. The humans, for their part, seemed genuinely surprised by the level of interest their tactics had generated. Captain confided to him that her superiors had expected to serve primarily in support roles for the foreseeable future, helping to resolve minor conflicts and providing escort services for merchant convoys. The idea that they would become the subject of galaxy-wide military analysis had not been part of their planning. But they adapted quickly, as humans seem to do with everything. Within a month, the human embassy had established a military cooperation office staffed with officers specifically trained in cross-species tactical consultation. They offered carefully controlled demonstrations of their capabilities, shared selected technical innovations, and provided training programs designed to help other species think more creatively about military problem-solving. The results were immediate and dramatic. Conflicts that had dragged on for years were suddenly resolved through innovative approaches that neither side had previously considered. Pirates and raiders found their traditional tactics useless against enemies who refused to follow predictable patterns. Even diplomatic negotiations began to benefit from the human approach of identifying underlying assumptions and finding creative alternatives. But perhaps the most significant change was less tangible but more profound. The galaxy's military establishments began to think differently about the nature of warfare itself. The human concept of asymmetric tactics was studied and adapted by dozens of species, each finding ways to apply the principles to their own strategic situations. Recognized it for what it was, an intellectual revolution that would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come. The humans had done more than win a single battle. They had introduced new ways of thinking about conflict that would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout known space. As he prepared his final report on the integration of human military concepts into doctrine, found himself remembering Captain's words about adaptation and survival. The galaxy was indeed entering a new phase of development, one where success would depend more on flexibility and creativity than on raw force or advanced technology. The humans had shown them that evolution was not just a biological process. It was a strategic one as well, and those who failed to evolve would find themselves facing the same fate as the fleet at Altair Prime, defeated not by superior force, but by superior thinking. The age of predictable warfare was ending. The age of human innovation had begun. 2 years had passed since the Battle of Altair Prime, and the galaxy had settled into what historians would later call the New Balance. Human military advisors worked alongside the defense forces of 43 different species, their unconventional approaches to warfare having proved their value in dozens of smaller conflicts. Trade routes that had been plagued by piracy for generations were now secure. Territorial disputes that had festered for decades were resolved through creative diplomacy backed by innovative military pressure. And even the most aggressive expansionist powers had learned to approach conflicts with greater caution. Commander, now bearing the rank of Admiral following his promotion after Altair Prime, stood in the command center of the newly constructed Joint Defense Station at Nexus. The facility was itself a symbol of the changes that had swept through galactic civilization, a massive structure designed and built through cooperation between 17 different species, incorporating the best technologies and tactical concepts from each contributing civilization. The station's human contingent was smaller than most others, reflecting their species' relatively recent arrival in the galactic community, but their influence on the facility's design and operation was unmistakable. Every system had backup protocols based on human redundancy principles. Every tactical plan included alternative approaches derived from human asymmetric doctrine. Even the station's physical layout reflected the human philosophy that form should follow function rather than tradition or aesthetic preference. Admiral had requested assignment to Nexus specifically because it represented everything he had come to believe about the future of galactic defense. No single species, no matter how advanced or powerful, could adequately address the full spectrum of threats that emerged in a galaxy containing thousands of intelligent civilizations. Only through cooperation and integration of different approaches could they hope to maintain the peace that had taken so many generations to achieve. But today, that peace was being tested. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority alert from the outer sensor nets. Multiple unidentified contacts approaching from the direction of the void reaches." Felt his primary heart skip a beat. The void reaches were the designation given to the vast, empty region beyond the galaxy's outer spiral arm, where no known civilizations existed and few exploration missions had ever ventured. For ships to appear from that direction suggested either the discovery of a previously unknown species or the return of something that had chosen to leave galactic space for reasons of its own. Number and classification of contacts. Still analyzing, sir. Initial readings suggest at least 200 vessels of varying sizes, but their energy signatures are unusual. The main tactical display activated, showing a three-dimensional representation of local space. At the edge of the sensor range, a cluster of red icons marked the approaching fleet. Even at this distance, could see that the formation was unlike anything in the standard databases of known ship configurations. "Sir," his tactical officer added, "I'm reading energy patterns that don't match any recognized propulsion systems, and their formation structure suggests a level of coordination that would require either extremely advanced computer systems or some form of collective consciousness." A chill ran through the command center as the implications of that statement sank in. Collective consciousness was not unknown in the galaxy, but species that possessed such capabilities were generally either very peaceful or very dangerous. There was rarely anything in between. Estimated time to arrival in system. At current velocity, approximately 14 hours, sir. Signal Galactic Defense Command. Priority 1 alert. Unknown fleet approaching from the void reaches. Probable first contact situation. Paused, considering his options. And request immediate consultation with all available human tactical advisors. The next several hours passed in a blur of activity as defense forces throughout the local sector responded to the alert. Within 6 hours, ships representing 22 different species had arrived at Nexus, their crews prepared for anything from a peaceful first contact scenario to a full-scale invasion. Captain Sarah, now promoted to Commodore and serving as the senior human military advisor for the sector, arrived aboard the human vessel, a ship designated as the UES Determination. Like all human military craft, it was smaller than most comparable vessels, but had learned to look beyond size when evaluating human capabilities. "Admiral," said as she materialized in the command center via holographic projection, "I've reviewed the sensor data. This is unlike anything we've encountered before." "Your assessment, Commodore?" "The coordination level suggests either a hive mind or an artificial intelligence network. The energy signatures indicate technology that's at least partially based on principles we don't recognize. And the fact that they're approaching from the void reaches means they've either developed faster-than-light travel that doesn't rely on the galactic network, or they've been traveling for a very long time. Nodded grimly, each possibility carried its own set of troubling implications. Recommendations. Standard first contact protocols, but with full defensive preparations. We approach this as if we're meeting potential allies, but we plan for the possibility that there's something else entirely. Paused, her expression growing serious. Admiral, there's something else. My technical staff has been analyzing the energy patterns from these ships, and they've identified some components that suggest the vessels might be partially organic. Organic? Living ships, Admiral, or at least ships with living components integrated into their systems. It would explain the coordination level and the unusual energy signatures. Before could respond, the communications officer called out urgently. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the approaching fleet. It's in perfect galactic standard. The main display shifted to show an image that would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. The being that appeared was roughly humanoid in shape, but obviously not from any known species. Its skin had a translucent quality that revealed complex patterns of light flowing beneath the surface, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed both ancient and alien. Greetings to the inhabitants of this galaxy, the being said, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple vocal cords or perhaps some form of technological enhancement. I am speaker of the hegemony of the First Dawn. We have returned to reclaim what was once ours. The silence that followed was absolute, felt as if the temperature in the command center had suddenly dropped by 20 degrees. The implications of the alien's words were staggering. This was not a first contact situation. This was an encounter with a species that claimed prior ownership of galactic space. Admiral said quietly, I recommend immediate activation of all defense protocols. This has just become a potential invasion scenario. Nodded and activated the general alert system. Throughout the station and the assembled fleet, klaxons began to sound as ships powered weapons and raised shields. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it as prepared as possible. The alien continued speaking, seemingly oblivious to the defensive preparations taking place around Nexus. We departed this region of space 12,000 of your standard years ago, when the younger races first began to develop capabilities. We chose exile rather than dominance, believing that the galaxy would benefit from evolution without our direct guidance. 12,000 years. Tried to comprehend the implications of that. The oldest known civilizations in the galaxy could trace their histories back perhaps 3,000 years. This species claimed to have left galactic space before most current civilizations had even developed written language. However, continued, our monitoring systems have detected developments that require our intervention. The recent integration of human military doctrine into galactic defense networks represents a fundamental shift toward more aggressive conflict resolution. This cannot be permitted to continue. Felt his secondary heart stop beating entirely. The aliens weren't here to reclaim territory or resources. They were here because of humanity's influence on galactic military thinking. Commodore, he said quietly too, it appears your species has attracted the attention of entities that consider themselves our supervisors. So it would seem, Admiral, and based on their energy signatures, they have the technology to back up their claims. His voice carried a note of grim acceptance. The question is whether they're here to negotiate or to dictate terms. The answer came immediately as image was replaced by a tactical display showing the approaching fleet. The ships were massive, easily dwarfing even the largest vessels in the galactic defense network, and they moved with a coordination that spoke of either perfect communications or shared consciousness. Most disturbing of all, they were accelerating rather than decelerating as they approached the system. All ships, ordered, assume defensive formation Alpha 9. This is now officially a hostile contact situation. The assembled fleet moved into position with practiced precision. Ships from dozens of different species, coordinating their movements according to protocols developed through 2 years of joint training exercises. It was, reflected, the first real test of whether the integrated defense concepts pioneered after Altair Prime would work against a truly advanced opponent. Admiral, his sensor officer called out, the alien fleet is slowing to velocity. Estimated arrival in local space, 37 minutes. Commodore, are your ships prepared for combat? As prepared as we can be against unknown technology, Admiral. But I have to point out that we're facing the same situation the faced at Altair Prime. An enemy whose capabilities we don't understand, fighting by rules we don't recognize. With one crucial difference, replied. This time we have humans on our side from the beginning. Smile was visible even through the holographic projection, and it carried the same predatory quality that had made the fleet retreat in disorder. Admiral, I think it's time these ancient beings learned something about how evolution works. The next 35 minutes were spent in frantic preparation, as the combined fleet made ready for battle. Ships were repositioned to take advantage of the gravitational fields and asteroid debris in the local area, weapon systems were charged and targeted, and communication networks were established to coordinate what would probably be the largest space battle in galactic history. But more importantly, plans were made. The human tactical advisors worked with their counterparts from each species to develop strategies that incorporated everything learned over the past 2 years about asymmetric warfare. If the alien fleet expected to face opponents who would fight according to traditional space combat doctrine, they were about to be severely disappointed. When the enemy fleet finally arrived in local space, the scope of the challenge became clear. 217 ships, each one larger than anything in the Galactic Defense Network, arranged in a formation that spoke of absolute confidence in their technological superiority. Energy readings suggested weapon systems that could probably destroy entire planets, and shield generators that would likely shrug off anything the defenders could throw at them. Admiral said quietly, "This is where we find out if David really can beat Goliath." The first alien ship to enter optimal firing range opened communications again. Speaker appeared on the main display, his translucent features showing what might have been disappointment. The younger races have chosen to resist rather than submit to guidance. This is regrettable but not unexpected. You will be given one final opportunity to stand down before we begin reclamation procedures. Activated the response channel. Speaker, this galaxy is home to 47 sovereign species who have chosen cooperation over domination. We will not surrender our independence to beings who abandoned us 12,000 years ago. Then you will be taught the consequences of defying the natural order. The first alien attack came without warning, a beam of energy that passed harmlessly through the shields of a cruiser and somehow caused the ship's hull to simply dissolve. Within seconds, a vessel that had survived dozens of battles was reduced to its component atoms, its crew of 300 vanishing as if they had never existed. The silence that followed was broken by Commodore's voice, calm and professional despite the horrific nature of what they had just witnessed. All ships implement Protocol Omega, scatter formation, maximum evasion, target designation, free fire on any opportunity. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of something that made even the aliens' advanced sensors seem suddenly inadequate. Let's show them why humans never learned to surrender. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of the difference between power and effectiveness, between overwhelming force and tactical flexibility. The alien ships, for all their technological advancement, fought like generals from 12,000 years ago. They expected their enemies to face them in formation, to trade shots across open space, to accept losses in exchange for the chance to inflict damage through superior firepower. Instead, they found themselves facing opponents who refused to fight by any recognizable rules. Human ships appeared and disappeared like ghosts, using gravitational lensing and debris clouds to mask their approach before striking with surgical precision at what their analysis indicated were vulnerable systems. Ships from other species followed suit, adapting human tactics to their own capabilities and creating new combinations that no military database could have predicted. The aliens' weapons were devastatingly powerful, but they were designed to fight conventional opponents in conventional ways. When faced with enemies that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible, their technological advantages became less decisive. For 6 hours, the battle raged across the Nexus system. Ships were lost on both sides, but the pattern gradually became clear. The alien fleet was designed for intimidation and overwhelming force projection, while the Galactic Defense Network had evolved specifically to counter such advantages through superior tactics and coordination. By the time Speaker finally agreed to negotiations, his fleet had lost 37 ships to the Defender's 18. More importantly, they had lost something even more valuable, their aura of invincibility. The peace talks were conducted aboard the neutral ground of Nexus Station, with representatives from all 47 galactic species present to witness the proceedings. Appeared in person this time, his translucent features showing signs of what might have been either fatigue or deep thought. "We underestimated the degree to which the younger races have evolved," he said without preamble. "The coordination and tactical innovation you demonstrated during our engagement suggests capabilities that did not exist when we departed this region of space." Admiral, speaking for the Galactic Coalition, nodded respectfully. "Speaker, we have learned much in 12,000 years. Perhaps most importantly, we have learned that cooperation achieves more than domination, and that diversity of approach creates strength rather than weakness." "And the humans?" His attention turned to Commodore, who had remained silent throughout the preliminary discussions. "Your species appears to be the catalyst for many of these changes. What role do you see for yourselves in this galaxy's future?" Stood, her small frame somehow commanding attention from beings that represented civilizations spanning thousands of years of development. "Speaker, humanity has no interest in ruling over other species or imposing our values on galactic civilization. We're here to contribute what we can and to learn from others in return." "And what do humans contribute?" "We ask questions that others might not think to ask. We look for solutions that others might not consider. We remind everyone, including ourselves, that the way things have always been done isn't necessarily the way they have to be done." Paused, her eyes meeting those of the ancient being across the negotiation table. "Most importantly, we remember that survival isn't about being the strongest or the most advanced. It's about being adaptable enough to meet whatever challenges the universe presents." Was quiet for several minutes, his translucent features shifting through patterns that might have been deep consideration. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of what sounded like genuine respect. 12,000 years ago, we left this galaxy because we believed that the younger races needed to develop without our interference. Today, you have proven that our decision was correct. You have evolved beyond our expectations, creating forms of cooperation and innovation that we ourselves had not achieved." He stood, his imposing presence filling the negotiation chamber. "The hegemony of the First Dawn formally recognizes the sovereignty of the current galactic civilization. We will not attempt to reclaim territories or impose guidance upon species that have proven themselves capable of independent development." The relief that swept through the chamber was almost tangible. Representatives from dozens of species had been holding their breath, waiting to learn whether their civilization would be allowed to continue existing or would be dissolved by beings with technology beyond their ability to resist. But was not finished. "However, we offer an alternative arrangement. The hegemony possesses knowledge and capabilities that might prove useful to your continued development. We are prepared to share selected technologies and information in exchange for the opportunity to observe and learn from your own innovations." It was, Admiral realized, exactly the kind of creative solution that human thinking had brought to galactic civilization. Instead of domination or submission, they were being offered partnership with a species whose capabilities were beyond anything they had previously imagined. The negotiations continued for 3 days, working out the details of what would become known as the Accords. The ancient beings would establish a small research station in the galactic outer rim, where they could study current civilization while sharing selected knowledge with species that expressed interest in technological exchange. In return, they would provide early warning of potential threats from beyond galactic boundaries and serve as advisors for situations that required capabilities beyond current understanding. As the formal ceremony concluded and representatives began to return to their home systems, Admiral found himself standing once again in the observation deck of Nexus Station. But this time, he was not alone. Commodore stood beside him, watching as the combined fleet dispersed back to their regular duties. "Commodore," he said quietly, "I have been thinking about what Speaker said regarding the role of humans in galactic development. Do you believe his assessment was accurate?" Was quiet for a moment before answering. "Admiral, I think he was partially correct. Humans do tend to ask uncomfortable questions and look for unconventional solutions, but the real change in galactic civilization wasn't caused by humanity alone. Explain. What happened at Altair Prime, and again today, wasn't the result of human tactics or human technology. It was the result of different species working together, combining their unique capabilities in ways that none of them could have achieved independently. Turned to face him, her expression serious. They provided the disciplined coordination that made our chaotic tactics effective. The other species contributed their own innovations and adaptations. Even the ancient beings, in their own way, provided the pressure that forced us all to evolve beyond our previous limitations. Admiral considered this. It was, he reflected, a very human way of looking at the situation, crediting others for successes that could legitimately be claimed as their own. And now, he asked, what comes next for galactic civilization? Now we keep learning, keep adapting, keep asking questions that make everyone uncomfortable, including ourselves. Smiled, and for once it carried no predatory edge, only genuine warmth. Admiral, the universe is a big place, full of challenges we can't even imagine yet. The only way to survive and thrive is to stay flexible, stay curious, and never assume that the way we've always done things is the only way they can be done. As if summoned by her words, a priority alert chimed from the station's communication systems. Admiral and Commodore exchanged a look before hurrying back to the command center, where they found the communications staff in a state of controlled excitement. Sir, the communications officer reported, we're receiving signals from the galactic core region. Multiple civilizations are requesting assistance with what they're describing as impossible physics events occurring near the central black hole. Admiral felt that familiar sensation of standing at the edge of the unknown. Commodore, it appears that the universe has decided to present us with our next challenge. Smile returned, carrying just a hint of that predatory quality that had struck fear into the hearts of enemies across the galaxy. Admiral, I believe I speak for all of humanity when I say, we're ready. As alert signals began to sound throughout Nexus Station and ships prepared for yet another journey into the unknown, Admiral reflected on the changes that had transformed galactic civilization over the past 2 years. They had learned to fight differently, to think differently, and to work together in ways that no single species could have achieved alone. Most importantly, they had learned that evolution was not something that happened to them, but something they could actively participate in. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders and terrors beyond imagination, but they would face whatever came next together, as partners in the greatest adventure in the history of intelligent life. The age of human innovation had indeed begun, but it had become something larger. The age of galactic cooperation, where the combined wisdom and creativity of dozens of species could meet any challenge the universe chose to present. And somewhere in the depths of space, other beings watched and waited, some with interest, some with concern, and some with plans of their own. The galaxy was a vast place, and humanity's story was just beginning.